Bret, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so very much for being here this evening. We appreciate it.
It's an honor to be with you.
And we appreciate everything that you do and all that you stand for and continue to warn about, to outline, to analyze. To my mind, you're much more than a columnist, much more than a thought leader. You're also an activist through your writing, and I appreciate it. I want to begin with reference to the column that you wrote in the wake of the massacre, really, at Bondi Beach in Australia. And essentially, you took the time to express that, contrary to the views of Albanese, that this was something that could not possibly be understood, it was actually an attack that could more than have been anticipated.
I was in Australia just the summer before last, and wherever I went, both in Sydney and in Melbourne, leaders of the Australian Jewish community, which numbers, I don't know, about 100,000 or so, were expressing a mounting sense of alarm. And in fact, not long after I was in Melbourne, one of the Orthodox synagogues there was firebombed. A kosher restaurant in Sydney was also firebombed. Those were attributed to the Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, but vandalism, defacement, attacks on daycare centers, all of this was creating a sense of mounting threat. And the Albanese government didn't seem to understand what the problem was, in part because the Albanese government is the problem. When you are lighting a kind of an ideological fire by continuously demonizing Israel, not just as he does, but particularly his invidious foreign secretary did, when you unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, you're creating a permissive climate for the demonization of Israel. And if you demonize the Jewish state, then it is not a far step to imagine, certainly among fanatics, that it is permitted to attack Jews as presumptive supporters of that demonic Jewish state. So this is a real problem intellectually that leaders in the West have, particularly in the left, where they think that they can buy off domestic constituents. And by the way, politics is obviously a very important part of this. They can buy off domestic constituencies in the coin of anti-Israel vitriol, and then turn around and pretend that they are supporting and defending and protecting their Jewish communities. This is true in Australia. This is true with almost exactly the same kinds of problems in Canada, in Great Britain, elsewhere in the world, and I'm afraid that's exactly what's happening right now and perhaps to an even greater degree in the city in which we're speaking.
So, as I look at what happened in Australia, and as I look, quite frankly, at the macabre marksmanship and abilities of the shooters, I'm aware of the fact that, like the country in which I grew up, Australia does not have a gun culture. I'm aware of the fact that, unlike like the country in which I live now, Israel does not have a gun culture. A lot of people think that it might do because everybody serves in the military, but actually it's far from it. The United States of America, without going into the virtues of the right to bear arms or not, because I've learned never to do that, especially in a British accent, but there are many guns here, and there are many weapons here, and there are many people who are trained here. And I wondered if you would share with us, when you look at what happened in Australia, how far away, or perhaps we're already in the dynamic of seeing similar events taking place here in the United States. Now, we all know about Poway, and we know about Tree of Life, and we know about others. We know about the Washington, D.C. attack. But I'm wondering when this might become more intensive, and I wonder if you could, my last question there, how prepared for this threat do you feel that the Jewish community currently is? How seriously do they take it?
You know, I do a lot of public speaking across the country at synagogues, Jewish community centers, and it has been striking to me, because I've been doing it for at least 20 years, how with every successive year the security measures that are available and present are growing. I mean, every one of you saw this walking into this shul this evening. But as they're growing, the threat is growing. I had security in my driveway for several days this fall, in September and again around October 6th and October 7th, because of a threat to my to my home. I mean, that is something that never would have occurred to me as being possible just a few years ago, certainly before October 7th. You saw what happened at a synagogue for the Nefesh B'Nefesh fundraiser just a few streets from here. I think all of us, after what happened at Bondi on the beach, had a pit of our stomach sensation that it's going to happen here. I don't know where, and I don't know when, but I suspect it's going to happen perhaps soon.
And how...
Horrible to say.
It is horrible to say, but what I wonder is, you might see it and you may speak on it, but are you able in any way to gauge how prepared for that, in addition to the security? You know, one of the phrases that I say to rabbis is that they should be saying from the podium that Jews in the pews is not enough. They actually need to be in the dojos and the gyms, and they need to learn how to fire and protect themselves and the things that they love and the facilities that they so love. When you warn about this, how receptive do you feel that the American Jewish establishment is?
I think it's in transition. I think it's a very different flavor of reaction post October 7th than before October 7th. I think after October 7th, I saw reports up in Scarsdale, Larchmont, gun ranges were populated by Orthodox Jews, and I think that's a good thing. We have a right to bear arms in this country. You can have a debate about the merits of it, but since we have that right, I hope responsible people responsibly take measures to protect themselves, and I think that's very true of the Jewish community. We are a community uniquely under threat. You don't have to go very far from where we are to discover that. I don't see many churches around the country or many temples around the country with the kind of security that we have here tonight. There's a reason for that. And I also, what I find so distressing is the kind of insouciance and nonchalance on the part of people who are supposed to care about the interests of minorities to the security and the interests of this particular minority. So there's a disconnect between what many liberals and progressives are saying about their concern for the welfare of minorities who are under threat, and the sense that something needs to be done about it. I think in part it's because the left's concept of what constitutes a minority is a very narrow concept.
Speak on that for a moment, if you would, that last sentence.
The problem that you have on the left is that it has a kind of a notion of identity politics, which is highly structured around concepts of race and privilege, without taking into account the fact that there are other forms of risk and other forms of bigotry. And I think it also has to do with the inability on the part of the left to understand that while anti-Semitism in many respects is a bigotry like all the others, in some respects it's unique. It's not like other forms of bigotry. Anti-Semites, racists always think they're punching down. They always think they're punching down. Anti-Semites, you kind of take a brief survey of anti-Semitic literature. Anti-Semites always think they're punching up. So they always think that they are kind of below, punching up to the guys who are in power. And who's in power? Of course, it's the Jews. And why is it the Jews? Because the Jews, in their vision of the world, have money, and money equals privilege, and money equals power. Now, if you kind of do a historical survey, not just for the Jewish community, but for other communities, you see that actually sometimes the minorities that are most at risk are minorities that have economic power without political power. So what happened to the Indians in Uganda, for instance? What happened to the Chinese in Indonesia? Those were rich minorities that had no political power, and as a result, they were persecuted and in many cases killed or expelled. And that's also been the story of Jews in Europe, in the Middle East, and my grave fear is that it could be happening here. One of the things that makes America remarkable, Benjamin, is that the Calvinists brought with them on the Mayflower this idea. It's kind of crazy because Calvin was actually a raging anti-Semite, but Calvinism had this idea that worldly success was a sign of divine favor. And so it meant that as people or communities rose in the United States, they were met, generally speaking, with admiration rather than envy. Admiration and envy are two sides of the same coin. And so in America, successful people who kind of come out of nowhere, or successful communities that had surprised the larger society by doing well, tended to be met with admiration. And that's why the United States proved to be the golden Medina for the Jewish community. Elsewhere where Jews went, our success was met with envy, and envy ultimately led to persecution. Here in the United States, our success was met with admiration, and admiration led to integration, assimilation, and rewards. What I worry about is that a politics of envy is now infecting American life. It's done so on the left, and to a growing extent, it's doing so on the right. And that, I think, puts Jews in a uniquely perilous position.
Yeah, if I can just pick up on that for a moment or two, the first time that I ever came to New York City was with my brother at this time of year, several years ago. And we walked through Times Square, and we looked on in amazement, in stunned amazement, at the fact that shopkeepers and business owners could display a menorah, a lit menorah, Hanukkah, in their storefront window as a sign of this having been welcomed into society, as a sign of inclusiveness, as a sign of feeling that they belonged. And I think in the intervening years between then and now, those who display their Hanukkah in their storefront windows, if they are still are doing it much more as a sign of defiance than feeling welcomed. And I think that that's something that is relevant and opposite to
I'll
what
tell you a
said.
story to this effect.
Yeah.
My mother was a hidden child in the war. After October 7th, she now lives, she's elderly, lives pretty much alone. But she very much has her wits about her. And we were watching footage, she and I, of a Jewish student on Harvard Yard, or in Harvard Yard, being mobbed and surrounded and bullied by the pro-Hamas mob. And my mother looked at me and she said, Bret, I was born in hiding. I'm not going to die in hiding. And so she hung an Israeli flag from her door. And that, I think, is the spirit that the Jewish community has to adopt very broadly everywhere we go. We do not have the option of sort of ducking our heads, choosing not to fight today, deciding this is an argument we don't need to have. We have to meet the moment every single day. I coined the phrase October 8th Jews, because the October 8th Jews are the ones who woke up after the worst massacre in our modern history to discover that that so many people in communities we thought we understood, we thought we inhabited, weren't just not condoling with us. They were jubilant at the thought that over 1,000 Jews had been slaughtered. They were jubilant at the sight of hostages helplessly being dragged to Gaza. They were jubilant, these feminists and progressives, seeing women who had clearly been sexually assaulted and raped. There was no pity for them. And that's what I think made the October 8th Jew. Those of us who woke up and understood who our friends are not. And that should lead to a set of conclusions, some of them unpleasant conclusions, but bracing conclusions about what we have to do to survive and thrive as a community. And I know you probably want to jump in with a question, but I just want to make this point. There are two strategies that Jews historically can take with respect to the wider world. One is what I call an ingratiation strategy, and the other is a respect strategy. Now, the ingratiation strategy is what Jews broadly pursued for most of our history in the United States. We were like model citizens. We're like your competent urologist and your good quality lawyer and you're a nice neighbor and we're funny on TV and we cured polio, so you should like us, right? That was the ingratiation strategy. But what you learn as early as middle school is you only get to ingratiate yourself once. And when that fails, you can't just try harder at ingratiation. The alternative model is the respect strategy. And I think that was actually the model that the African American community adopted in the years after the 1960s. It wasn't enough for the African American community to say, great, we now have the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the series of laws that ended formal discrimination. Black America stood up for itself and said, we are not going to accept racism in any form. We're going to make it culturally absolutely unacceptable. We are going to change the cultural tone in this country. We are going to enforce taboos, social taboos, that will have real penalties because we are not going to be mistreated ever again, period. Enough. And America took notice, and they went, oh yeah, That was actually the right strategy. What have Jews been doing? We listen to, Mamdani talk about I don't use the terms globalize the intifada, that's not language I would use, or all this stuff. And we go, well, he seems okay, he's moderating, or we negotiate with ourselves about what's acceptable and unacceptable. I don't see Black America negotiating with racists about what's okay and what's not okay. And as a result, there's a completely different relationship, right? I think we actually have to pay attention to what Black America did in the last 40 or 50 years and say, we need to borrow from that. We need to take a page from that magic because we're not going to be liked again, but we can be respected again.
I agree. So just some final questions, Bret, if I may. You spoke about the right to bear arms. I spoke about the right to bear arms. There seems to be a perversion taking place of some of the inalienable rights that we so appreciate. I'll give you an example. If Tucker Carlson were to espouse the Jew hatred that he overtly, in my opinion, espouses, it's impossible to mistake it for anything else, in once Great Britain, his microphone would be seized from him at that point. You actually wouldn't hear that degree of rhetoric because you don't have the freedom of speech as enshrined in British law as you do here in the United States. And he is allowed to run roughshod over norms of conversation and messaging in a manner that I never encountered during my upbringing in Britain. And I experienced anti-Semitism on a daily basis. I'm speaking about Tucker Carlson because for years I've warned about Jew hatred on the left, and were I to identify myself politically as far as policy is concerned, I would assign myself to the right of the political aisle, and therefore I feel it's incumbent upon me to call it out on my side where I see it so clearly. And I'm deeply troubled not only by that perversion, but his proximity to the circles of power here in the United States. Where does this tendency go to? And he's not alone. We know the names of Candace Owens as well, Darryl Cooper. These people are everywhere now.
Well, what is my nightmare scenario is that these people are the J.D. Vance administration in 2029. That's what I'm afraid of. Jews can't pretend that the bad guys are on the left if you happen to be on the right, or they're vice versa on the right if you happen to be on the left. We have to recover our instinct for danger. And what's so alarming now is that both sides at the fringes are being infected, and this infection is moving towards the center. I mean, look, I'm a great believer in the First Amendment. I would not take away Tucker Carlson's podium, as loathsome as I think that he is. And of course, it's very heartening to know that someone like my old friend Barry Weiss is now in charge of CBS News. We should be doing a lot more of that. And we Jews who have been so innovative in so many fields and so many industries, it's not like we lack for an ability to make a good argument. Ben Shapiro, of course, is phenomenal. But we need to do a lot more of this. When we complain about the media, I sometimes hear complaints about the media you'd be surprised to learn, and maybe my corner of the media, right? But that's a call to start investing in all kinds of new media. You know, I'm looking at now the paper editions of the New York Sun, which I know there's some investors here, people who have dealt with it. We need 100 of those outlets. And they need to be creative, and we need to learn how to tailor messages to different demographics, whether it's kind of young, alienated, you know, white men or Latino. You know, I grew up in Mexico City. I'm very worried about rising anti-Semitism in the Latino community. It's a real thing. So what are we doing? I mean, we have to treat this as an emergency and rise to the occasion.
So one of the problems that we have, in my view, is that those who became very brazen after the October 7th attack when it came to peddling Jew hatred, and I believe that they became brazen because they assessed that Israel, the country, was in danger, and therefore Israel, the people, Jewish people everywhere, were perhaps there for the taking. What troubles me most about that is not that they've become brazen, but that they've actually learned that they can peddle this bigotry without penalty or punishment, and in the case of Mamdani, they might actually receive positive reward for it. So how do we put that back in its box?
Look, I actually take the view that Mamdani, to some extent, is an outlier. He won 52% of the vote, not a resounding victory against two very, very weak opponents. And the more interesting races, political races in November, to me, were in Virginia and New Jersey, where moderate centrist Democrats with national security credentials romped to gigantic victories. I think that's an investment that we need to make, particularly because Jews have primarily been part of the Democratic Party, to make sure that the Democratic Party doesn't completely lose its you-know-what mind. And the same also has to happen on the Republican side. But again, it's going to come down to the way Jews comport themselves, whether we are kind of simply begging the favor of others or we are demanding a kind of respect. And to me, the model is always Israel. I think with the 7-year error of the Oslo years, which was, by the way, Israel adopting its own version of the ingratiation strategy. Look, we'll make peace with Yasser Arafat and we'll get a Nobel Peace Prize for it, and people will like us again. Look how well that one worked out. You know, say what you will about Israel today. Okay, people get to heckle at Eurovision, you know, or whatever that is. What Israel is able to do, which is to me so extraordinary and impressive and necessary, is that they reestablished firmly in the minds of its enemies that Israel is not a country to be messed with at all, at all. And from Iran to Beirut to Damascus to Gaza City and Ramallah, they know that. And that was the message. That is the PR strategy. The PR strategy isn't to suddenly turn around and, you know, give every needy person a pill cam or all this stuff. You know, all that's great. Israel does great things every single day. It's a country to be immensely proud of, you know, from dawn till dusk, right? And in between. But that's not what Israelis had to do after October 7th. What they had to do is absolutely say, we are a force to be reckoned with. You are not going to touch a hair on the head of one of our own people. And what they were able to accomplish after taking the punch to the chin that they endured on October 7th, to stand up and absolutely demolish their enemies who thought they were so invincible, is nothing short of amazing. Every Jew should be proud of that fact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bret Stephens. Thank you. It's an honor to have you with us. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.